The Echoes of a Birthday Past, Chapter 1, The Glare of the Screen. The screen glowed, a cruel, mocking beacon in the dim light of my apartment. 30 candles, flickering. The cascade of laughter, frozen in time. My sister, Sarah, her face illuminated by the camera's flash, beaming. Around her, my parents, my aunts, my uncles, cousins, friends, all of them, smiling, celebrating, a surprise party for Sarah on my 30th birthday. My 30th birthday. I reread the caption. Happy 28th, sweet Sarah. So glad we pulled off this surprise. 28. Her birthday was in October. Mine was today, May 15th. A slow, chilling dread crawled up my spine. My phone had been silent all day. Not a single call. Not a text. Not even a simple happy birthday from my own mother. I'd spent the day in a haze of self-pity and microwave popcorn, telling myself they were busy, telling myself I shouldn't expect much. But this was a punch to the gut. A public, undeniable declaration of where I stood in their lives, or more accurately, where I didn't. I scrolled through the endless photos, each one a fresh stab. Sarah opening gifts, her arms overflowing. My mother, Eleanor, her arm wrapped around Sarah, a look of pure adoration on her face. My father, Richard, usually so reserved, laughing heartily. It was a carnival of familial warmth, a tableau of belonging that I, Emily, had never quite fit into, not truly, not ever. A knot tightened in my stomach, a familiar ache that had been with me since childhood. Sarah, the golden child. Sarah, the extrovert. Sarah, the one who effortlessly commanded attention and affection. And then there was me, quiet, bookish, always on the periphery, observing, a shadow in their bright, vibrant world. I closed the laptop with a definitive snap, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence of my small Cincinnati apartment. The air felt thick, suffocating. 30 years. 3 decades of feeling like an outsider looking in. And now this final, undeniable proof. It wasn't just the party. It was the culmination. The missed calls, the forgotten anniversaries, the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in their tone when I spoke, compared to the open warmth they extended to Sarah. It was the way my mother's eyes would light up when Sarah walked into a room, a light that seemed to dim just a little when I entered. I walked to the window, staring out at the rain-slick streets of Over the Rhine. The city lights blurred through the falling drops, mirroring the blur of tears in my own eyes. Enough. I was done. Done with trying to earn their affection. Done with chasing after a sense of belonging that was clearly never meant for me. My grandmother, Rose. She was the only one who truly saw me, the only one who held me close and told me I was special. She died 5 years ago, and with her, it felt like the last true link I had to my family had snapped. Her small West Virginia home, nestled in the Appalachian foothills, was the only place I ever felt truly at peace. After she passed, my parents, in their rush to sell the property, told me to take anything I wanted from her belongings. I had been too heartbroken at the time to do much more than grab a few photo albums and her favorite teacup. Now, a sudden, desperate urge filled me. I needed to go back. I needed to find something. Anything. a scrap of her love, a tangible reminder that I wasn't entirely alone. The decision was made in a flash of icy resolve. I would cut ties, all of them, and then I would drive to West Virginia, to Grandma Rose's house, to find a piece of myself, a piece of her, that might explain this profound, inexplicable emptiness. The unseen thread. The drive from Cincinnati to my grandmother's house in rural West Virginia was a blur of highway miles and simmering resentment. Each mile took me further from the stinging memory of that Facebook post, but also further from the faint hope of reconciliation that still, foolishly, lingered somewhere deep inside. I didn't want to hope anymore. Hope hurt too much. The house stood silent and still, framed by ancient oak trees, just as I remembered. It was a modest 2-story farmhouse, worn by time but filled with a quiet dignity. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of dust and old wood. My parents had sold the house 3 years ago, but the new owners, a quiet couple who had moved in from out of state, had left a small, detached shed untouched in the back. My grandmother had used it for storage, a place where she kept old gardening tools, out-of-season decorations, and what she affectionately called her memory boxes. I had called the new owners, explained my request, and they, bless their hearts, had readily agreed to let me retrieve anything I might have left behind. I pushed open the shed door. Sunlight streamed through a grimy window, illuminating dancing motes of dust. Cobwebs hung like forgotten lace. In the far corner, beneath a tarp, stood a large wooden trunk. Not a box, a trunk. Dark, heavy oak, bound with iron straps. I remembered it now. Grandma Rose always kept it locked, a mysterious, imposing presence in her attic. I had forgotten about it entirely. With a grunt, I pulled away the tarp. The trunk was covered in a thin layer of dust. I ran my fingers over the smooth, cool wood. A small, tarnished brass padlock secured it. I pulled at it, but it was firmly shut. Of course. Grandma Rose was meticulous about her secrets. Suddenly, I remembered. Her old silver locket, the one she always wore, had a tiny key hidden inside. She had shown me once, years ago, when I was a curious child fascinated by her jewelry box. After her funeral, I had kept the locket. It was tucked away in a small box on my dresser back in Cincinnati. A faint flicker of hope, cold but persistent, ignited within me. I drove back to Cincinnati, the journey feeling endless. The locket was where I remembered it, nestled amongst costume jewelry. My fingers fumbled with the delicate clasp, and there it was, a tiny, intricate key, no bigger than my thumbnail. It was almost perfectly camouflaged. The next morning, I was back in West Virginia, the key clutched in my palm. My hands trembled slightly as I inserted it into the padlock. A faint click. The lid of the trunk creaked open, revealing a treasure trove of forgotten memories. Inside, carefully stacked, were bundles of yellowed letters tied with faded ribbons. Photographs, black and white, some sepia-toned, depicting faces I recognized and some I didn't. Pressed flowers, their colors muted by time, and tucked beneath a stack of old lace doilies. A series of bound journals, their covers worn smooth. Alongside them, a small vintage cassette player and a collection of unlabeled audio cassettes. My grandmother was a prolific writer. I knew that. She loved to document everything, from her gardening successes to her philosophical musings. But these journals felt different. They were thick, filled with her neat, elegant handwriting. And the letters? Some were addressed to her, some to my parents, but many were unsent, seemingly drafts or thoughts she hadn't dared to share. I picked up the top journal. The first few pages were mundane, typical entries about daily life. Then, as I flipped further, I noticed a change in the handwriting. It became more hurried, more intense. A date caught my eye. May 15th, 1995. My birthday. My heart pounded. This was it. This was where the answers were hidden. I settled onto the dusty floor of the shed. The faint scent of old paper and wood filling my nostrils. I began to read. Chapter 3. The Whispers of a Secret. The first few journal entries from May 1995 were disjointed, almost frantic. Grandma Rose wrote about the burden, the truth that claws, and the promise I made. Her handwriting was shaky, sometimes illegible. She frequently mentioned Eleanor's grief and Richard's silence. And then, in a bold, underlined entry dated May 18th, 1995, just 3 days after my birth, I found it. They cannot bear it. Eleanor, she sees her every time she looks at Emily. The resemblance is undeniable. A ghost. Richard tries to be strong, but his eyes, they betray him. We had to do something, for their sake, for Emily's sake. The truth would shatter us all. And poor Eleanor, she has already lost so much. One child gone, another almost lost. This was the only way. My breath hitched. What resemblance? What ghost? What was lost? My mind reeled. This was not the sweet, gentle grandmother I knew. This was a woman burdened by a profound secret. I skipped ahead, desperate for more clarity. The entries continued, interspersed with fragments of despair and moments of profound love for me. Grandma Rose wrote about my bright eyes and knowing gaze. She often repeated variations of, "She deserves to know." But how can I tell her? And the secret binds us, suffocates us. Then came a collection of letters. One was addressed to Eleanor and Richard, dated a few months after my birth, unsent. My dearest Eleanor and Richard, I know this burden weighs heavily on your hearts. The pain of losing little Clara. It was unbearable. And then the accident, the tragic loss of Mary. It broke me to see her go, just when she was starting to find her feet as a mother. But Emily is a gift, a second chance, a way to heal. You have given her a loving home, a life she would not have had. Please do not let the past overshadow her future. She is your daughter, truly, and she needs your love, undivided. Clara? Mary? My head spun. Clara? My sister? But I only had Sarah, and who was Mary? The name resonated with a strange, distant familiarity, like a forgotten melody. I shuffled through the letters, my fingers trembling. Another envelope, slightly thicker, was simply marked, "For Emily, when the time is right." It was sealed. I tore it open. Inside was a single, folded sheet of paper, written in Grandma Rose's elegant hand, and a small, faded photograph. The photograph showed a woman, young and radiant, holding a newborn baby. The baby was me. The woman, her eyes were strikingly similar to mine, and her smile, a mirror image of the one I saw in my own reflection. I looked at the note. My dearest Emily, if you are reading this, then the time has come. The time for truth. What I am about to tell you will change everything you thought you knew about your family, about yourself. But please, know this. Every decision made, every secret kept, was done out of love. A misguided love, perhaps, but love nonetheless. You were not born to Eleanor and Richard. Your biological mother was Mary Thompson, a dear friend of our family. She was a beautiful, vibrant soul, full of life and dreams. She tragically died in a car accident just after you were born, leaving no other family. Before her death, she had entrusted you to Eleanor and Richard, knowing their deep desire for another child after the devastating loss of their firstborn, Clara, who died as an infant from a rare heart condition. They had tried for years to have another child, but after Clara's death, Eleanor struggled profoundly. The grief was overwhelming. When Mary asked them to take you, it was a lifeline, a chance for Eleanor to heal, to love again. They promised Mary they would raise you as their own, and they did. Bring themselves to tell you the truth, fearing the pain it would cause, fearing you would reject them, fearing it would reopen the wounds of Clara's death. They loved you, Emily. They still do. But the shadow of Mary and the tragic memory of Clara always hovered. They saw Mary in your eyes, and in their grief and fear, they created a distance, a protective barrier that, ironically, hurt you more than they could ever know. Sarah, your sister, she is their biological child, born a few years after you were brought into the family. Eleanor poured all her remaining hope and love into Sarah, perhaps to compensate for the unspoken truth about you, perhaps to solidify her own sense of motherhood. Sarah, being so young, absorbed some of this unspoken tension and, I believe, unintentionally contributed to your feeling of being an outsider. She heard whispers, saw the unspoken glances, and in her childlike way interpreted as you being different. I tried to tell them to be honest, but they were too afraid. I promised Mary I would watch over you, that you would know her story. This trunk, these journals, these tapes, they are my way of keeping that promise. Listen to the tapes, Emily. They will tell you everything I could not write down. Find your peace, my dear. Find your truth. And know that you are loved by me, by Mary, and even by Eleanor and Richard, in their own complicated way. With all my love, Grandma Rose. The world tilted. My breath came in ragged gasps. Not Eleanor and Richard's daughter. Adopted. A stranger's child. Mary, my real mother. My real mother was dead. Dead before I even knew her. And Clara, a sister I never knew existed, who had died. The pieces of the puzzle, jagged and painful, began to click into place. The distance, the unspoken grief. Sarah. It all made a horrifying, heartbreaking sense. I clutched the photograph, tracing the contours of Mary's face, my mother's face. She looked so kind, so loving. A profound, aching void opened in my chest. A lifetime of questions answered in a single, devastating letter. I reached for the cassette player, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped it. I inserted the first tape, labeled simply May 1995, My Confession. I pressed play. Chapter 4, The Voice of Truth. The hiss of the old cassette player filled the quiet shed, followed by the familiar, gentle voice of my grandmother. But this voice was different. It was laced with sorrow, with regret, with a raw emotional honesty I had never heard from her before. It is May 20th, 1995. Grandma Rose's voice began, shaky but clear. I am recording this because I cannot write it all down. Some truths are too painful to commit to paper, even if only for myself. Eleanor and Richard, they are crumbling. They lost Clara, their beautiful baby girl, just 3 years ago. a rare heart defect. The doctors said it was a miracle she even lived a few days. Eleanor, she never recovered. Her spirit was broken. They tried for years after, but no more children. And then, Mary. Poor sweet Mary. She was Eleanor's oldest friend. They grew up together. And Mary, bless her, found herself pregnant, alone. The father, he was never in the picture. And Mary, she was dying. A rare, aggressive cancer, discovered late in her pregnancy. She knew she wouldn't make it. My breath hitched. Cancer, not a car accident. The letter, my grandmother had protected me. She'd simplified the tragedy. Mary gave birth to Emily on May 15th, just like the doctors predicted. A healthy, beautiful baby girl. And Mary, she held Emily for barely an hour. She passed away shortly after, but not before making a final, desperate plea to Eleanor and Richard. She knew they longed for a child. She knew they would love Emily. And so in that hospital room, a silent promise was made. Eleanor and Richard took Emily home as their own. No questions asked. No one knew, except me and the doctors. We fabricated the birth certificate. It was wrong, so wrong. But what else could we do? Eleanor was finally holding a baby again. Her heart was mending. Richard, for the first time in years, had a spark in his eyes. I covered my mouth with my hand, a sob tearing through my chest. The depth of their pain. The desperate choices. My grandmother's voice continued, a somber narration of a family's silent agony. The hospital staff were sympathetic. They knew Eleanor's story about Clara. It was a small-town hospital in West Virginia. Things were different back then, less scrutiny. So they changed the records. It was a secret born of grief and a desperate hope for happiness. But a secret always festers, and it did. Emily, she was always a constant, living reminder of Mary and of Clara. The child they lost, it was like looking at a ghost. Eleanor struggled. She loved Emily, yes, but the shadow of Mary, the memory of Clara, was always there. It made her hesitant, distant. She poured herself into her work, into volunteer activities. And then Sarah was born. My grandmother's voice softened then, a fragile hope permeating her words. Sarah was a miracle, truly. Unplanned, unexpected. And in Sarah, Eleanor saw only hope. No ghosts, no shadows, just pure, unadulterated joy. She was the child who truly belonged to them, through blood and bone. And I saw the shift. The love Eleanor had for Emily was complicated. For Sarah, it was simple, pure, unburdened. It broke my heart to see Emily, so innocent, so bright, unknowingly pushed to the periphery. I tried to talk to Eleanor and Richard, to tell them that the truth, however painful, was necessary, that it would heal them. But they wouldn't listen. They clung to the secret, believing it protected Emily, believing it protected them. The tape clicked, signaling the end of the side. I flipped it over, my fingers still trembling. I watched Emily grow. Grandma Rose continued, her voice now filled with a profound sadness. A beautiful, sensitive child, always looking for affection, always trying to please. And Eleanor, she just couldn't give it to her completely. She couldn't explain why. And Emily, she felt it, that unspoken barrier, that sense of not quite belonging. Sarah, poor Sarah, she was so young when Emily came into their lives. She never knew the full truth. She just heard whispers, saw the pain in her parents' eyes when Emily was around. She heard conversations about Mary's eyes or Clara's tragedy, and in her own innocent, childish way, she started to see Emily as different, as someone who brought sadness. It wasn't malice, Emily. It was misunderstanding. It was a family fractured by an untold story. A profound understanding washed over me. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't a lack of love. It was grief. It was fear. It was a desperate attempt to protect themselves. And in doing so, they had inadvertently built a wall around me. The surprise party for Sarah, it suddenly made a terrible, tragic sense. May 15th wasn't just my birthday. It was the day Mary died. It was a day of profound loss for my parents. And perhaps the party for Sarah was a desperate attempt to create a new, happier memory on a day forever tainted by sorrow. A clumsy, painful attempt at deflection. I listened to all the tapes, hours of my grandmother's voice, each one adding another layer to the intricate, heartbreaking tapestry of my family's history. She chronicled my childhood, her observations of my parents' struggles, and her own despair over the secret. She spoke of her attempts to convince them to tell me, and their unwavering refusal, born of fear. By the time the last tape clicked silent, dusk had fallen. The shed was bathed in the soft, fading light of evening. I sat there, surrounded by the echoes of a past I never knew, my mind a swirling vortex of emotions, shock, sorrow, understanding, and a strange, quiet sense of peace. The raw, open wound of my abandonment finally had a name, and with a name came the possibility of healing. Chapter 5, Confrontation and Cracks. I drove back to Cincinnati, the trunk of my car laden with the journals, letters, and tapes. The weight of the secrets felt almost unbearable, yet paradoxically, lighter than the burden of ignorance I had carried for 3 decades. I needed to confront them, not with anger, but with the truth. The next morning, I stood before their front door, the very door that had felt like a barrier for so long. My hand hovered over the doorbell. Fear mingled with resolve. What if they denied it? What if they crumbled? What if this shattered what little connection we still had? I rang the bell. Eleanor opened the door, her face a mask of surprise. Emily? What a surprise! We thought you were still busy. Her voice was tentative, a hint of guilt in her eyes. We need to talk, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. All of us, and I think you know what about. Her gaze flickered to my car, to the faint outline of the trunk visible through the window. Her face paled. Richard's just finishing breakfast, she stammered, ushering me inside. We sat in the living room, the familiar space suddenly feeling alien. My parents sat opposite me on the sofa, their faces etched with apprehension. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I went to Grandma Rose's shed, I began, my voice clear and unwavering. I found her trunk, her journals, her letters, her tapes. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and resignation. Richard looked down at his hands, his shoulders slumping. Silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. I know about Mary, I continued, watching their reactions. I know about Clara. I know I'm adopted. Eleanor let out a soft whimper, tears welling in her eyes. Richard finally looked up, his face ashen. Emily, please, he started, his voice barely a whisper. Please don't, I interrupted, my voice tinged with a weariness that went beyond my years. Please don't try to deny it. Grandma Rose told me everything, every painful detail. The loss of Clara, Mary's death, the choices you made, the secret you kept. Eleanor was openly weeping now, tears streaming down her face. Richard reached for her hand, his own trembling. We wanted to protect you," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "We didn't want you to feel different. We didn't want you to feel the pain of Mary's loss or the burden of Clara's memory." "But you did, Mom, Dad," I said, my voice softening slightly, the anger beginning to give way to a profound sadness. "You protected me from the truth, but you didn't protect me from the pain of feeling like I never belonged, the pain of feeling like I was always on the outside looking in, the feeling that something was inherently wrong with me." Eleanor sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "Oh, Emily," she choked out, her voice muffled. "We loved you. We truly did. We didn't know how to navigate it. The grief was so raw. And when Mary asked us to take you, it felt like a miracle, a second chance. We didn't want to mess it up. We were so scared you'd leave us if you knew." "And Sarah?" I asked, the question hanging in the air. "Did she know?" Richard sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Not the full truth, not at first. She was so young when you came. She heard whispers. She saw our grief for Clara, and the way Eleanor sometimes struggled with you, seeing Mary in your eyes. She heard us talk about Mary's passing, about the tragedy. Children, they interpret things differently. She probably felt you were special in a way she wasn't, and I think perhaps a little jealous of the attention you initially received, even if it was tinged with sorrow. As she got older, she put pieces together, but we never truly sat her down and explained it all. We just hoped the secret would fade." "It didn't fade," I said, my voice tinged with bitterness. "It grew. It created a chasm between us. And yesterday, Sarah's birthday party, on my birthday, that was the final crack." Eleanor lifted her head, her eyes red and swollen. "Oh, Emily," she whispered, her voice filled with fresh anguish. That was an attempt to make a happy memory on a day that is forever marked by sorrow for us. May 15th. It's Mary's death day. It was Clara's due date. It's a day of profound grief. We didn't mean to hurt you. We tried to shift the focus, to create a new, happier association with the day for Sarah. It was wrong. So wrong. The raw honesty in her voice, the genuine pain in her eyes, broke through the last vestiges of my anger. It wasn't malice. It was fear. It was misguided love. It was a family shattered by unspoken grief, trying to piece themselves back together with fragile, invisible threads. Chapter 6. Threads of Forgiveness. The confession, raw and unvarnished, hung in the air. Eleanor and Richard, exhausted and emotionally drained, offered fragmented apologies, explanations that seemed both insufficient and profoundly human. They spoke of the burden of the secret, the fear of judgment, the crushing weight of their grief for Clara. "We always loved you, Emily," Richard insisted, his voice raspy. "You were our child, our miracle after so much loss. We were so afraid of losing you too, afraid of shattering the fragile peace we'd built." I looked at them, truly looked at them, for the first time in my life, without the filter of resentment. I saw two people, deeply flawed, profoundly scarred by tragedy, who had made a series of desperate choices born of love and fear. It didn't excuse their actions, but it explained them. "I understand why you did it," I said, my voice quiet, almost a whisper. "But it hurt. It hurt so much. All those years of feeling like I was less, like I didn't quite fit. That was the price of your secret." Eleanor sobbed harder, her head bowed. Richard reached across the table and took my hand. His grip was surprisingly firm. "We know, sweetheart. We know. And we are so, so sorry. More sorry than words can say." The anger, the burning resentment began to dissipate, replaced by a profound, aching sadness. Not just for myself, but for them. For the family we could have been, if only the truth had been spoken. "Sarah," I said, pulling my hand away gently. "Does she know the extent of it now?" Richard shook his head. "No, she knows bits and pieces, whispers she overheard. She knows that Mary was your biological mother, and that Mary passed away. But she doesn't know the full story of Clara, or the full circumstances of your adoption, or our struggles. We always hoped to tell her, but we never found the right time. We need to tell her," I stated unequivocally. "All of us, together. This secret has to end, for everyone." Eleanor lifted her head, her eyes still red. But a glimmer of something, relief, sparkled within them. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." "You're right." The conversation with Sarah was even harder than the one with my parents. We sat her down the next day, the three of us, in the same living room. Sarah, initially confused, then shocked, then heartbroken. She listened in stunned silence as Eleanor, then Richard, then I recounted the story. The loss of Clara, the death of Mary, my adoption, the secrets. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she listened, a new understanding dawning in her face. "You mean, Emily, you're not just my sister. You're from a different family?" she asked, her voice small. "And Mom and Dad, they just never told you?" "It was complicated, Sarah," I explained, reaching for her hand. "They were hurting. They lost their first baby. And then Mary, my biological mother, passed away. They were trying to heal, to build a new life with me. They thought they were protecting everyone by keeping it a secret." Sarah looked at our parents, a mixture of hurt and disbelief in her eyes. "But all these years? Why didn't you trust us? Why didn't you tell us?" Eleanor wept again. "We were cowards, honey. We were afraid. Afraid of losing you both. Afraid of the pain it would bring. We thought we were strong enough to carry it, but it broke us, piece by piece." Sarah, always the more expressive one, pulled her hand away from mine and stood up, walking to the window, her back to us. Her shoulders shook. The silence in the room stretched, thick with unspoken emotions. Then she turned. Her face was streaked with tears, but her gaze was clear. "The party," she said, her voice raw. Was it because of your birthday, Emily? Because it's Mary's death day?" Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. Sarah let out a shaky breath. "And I thought it was just about me. All this time, I thought you just didn't care about me, Emily. That you always kept your distance. And I thought it was because I was better or more loved. And I leaned into it. I really did. I'm so sorry." My heart ached for her, for the burden she had unknowingly carried, for the role she had played in my isolation. "It's okay, Sarah," I said, standing and walking towards her. "We were all just trying to survive, weren't we? In the dark." She turned, and for the first time in years, she hugged me. A real hug, not a perfunctory squeeze, but a desperate, clinging embrace. We stood there, two sisters, finally acknowledging the invisible wall that had separated us, beginning the slow, painful process of dismantling it. Chapter 7. The Unfolding Horizon. The days and weeks that followed were a delicate dance of renegotiation. Conversations that had been avoided for decades finally took place, sometimes halting, sometimes tearful, but always honest. My parents, stripped of their secret, seemed to breathe a little easier, though the guilt remained a palpable presence. My relationship with Eleanor and Richard began to tentatively heal. It wasn't a magical fix. Years of unspoken truths don't simply vanish. But there was a new openness, a willingness to listen, to understand. They began to share stories about Mary, my biological mother, piecing together fragments of her life from their memories. I learned she was a budding artist, a free spirit who loved to hike in the Appalachian Mountains. I learned about her favorite songs, her quirky sense of humor, her dreams of opening her own studio. Each detail was a precious gift, a brushstroke on the canvas of a life I had never known. Sarah and I found ourselves navigating a new dynamic. The easy familiarity of sisters who share a lifetime of jokes and childhood memories was still there. But now, beneath it, lay a deeper current of understanding and empathy. She apologized, again and again, for her past behavior, for the unintentional slights, for the ways she had unknowingly contributed to my isolation. I, in turn, acknowledged her own hurt, her own struggles within a family shrouded in secrets. We began to build a bridge, brick by painful brick, across the chasm that had separated us. I spent countless hours going through Grandma Rose's trunk, poring over the letters, re-listening to the tapes. I found more photographs of Mary, of her with my parents before my birth, their faces younger, unburdened by the losses to come. I even found a small, hand-drawn sketch signed Mary T. It was a landscape, a rolling vista of mountains and trees, undeniably West Virginia. I felt a profound connection to her through these tangible remnants of her life. Inspired by Mary's artistic spirit and my own newfound understanding of my roots, I decided to take a sabbatical from my job as a data analyst. I packed my bags, leaving the concrete jungle of Cincinnati, and headed back to West Virginia. Not to my grandmother's old house, but to a small, rented cabin deep in the mountains, a place that felt closer to Mary's spirit. I began to hike, to explore the wilderness she loved, to sketch the landscapes she had painted. It was a pilgrimage, a journey of self-discovery, and a way to connect with the mother I never knew. I also began researching Mary Thompson. The internet, a tool I had once used to uncover pain, now became a conduit for connection. I found old newspaper articles about her death, about the car accident, no mention of cancer. My grandmother had truly protected me from the harsher truth. I found a small obituary, listing no surviving family, but then, a few weeks later, I found a distant cousin of Mary's through an online genealogy forum, someone who remembered a Mary Thompson who had moved away years ago. We connected. She told me stories about Mary's vibrant personality, her wanderlust, her dreams. It was like finding missing pieces of my own puzzle. My 31st birthday arrived. This time, there was no Facebook post of a party for someone else. Instead, my phone rang. It was Eleanor. "Happy birthday, Emily," she said, her voice soft and heartfelt. "We're thinking of you. We love you." Later that day, Sarah called. "Happy birthday, Em. What are you doing out there in the wilderness? Should I send you a survival kit?" Her voice was light, teasing, full of the easy affection we were slowly rediscovering. I smiled, looking out at the endless expanse of green mountains. The air was crisp, clean, and filled with the scent of pine. The echoes of a birthday past, once filled with pain and betrayal, were finally beginning to fade. They were being replaced by the whispers of truth, the fragile threads of forgiveness, and the promise of a future where I, Emily, finally understood who I was. Not just a shadow, not just an outsider, but a woman with two mothers, a complex history, and a future waiting to be written. The healing had begun, and it felt like home.